The world did not end with a bang in 1945, but with a shiver that would last for nearly half a century. Imagine waking up every morning for 45 years knowing that the person on the other side of the planet has their finger on a button that could turn your city into ash before lunch. This is not a movie plot or a dystopian novel. This was the lived reality for 2 generations of human beings. It was a twilight struggle where no shot was officially fired between the titans, yet millions died in the shadows. It was a war of whispers, of backyard fallout shelters, of Olympic rivalries turned into ideological battlefields, and of 2 superpowers holding the entire deck of human civilization in a high-stakes game of poker where nobody could afford to fold. This is the definitive timeline of the Cold War, the era when the United States and the Soviet Union carved the world in two and dared the other to cross the line. The seeds of the conflict were sown even as the ruins of Berlin were still smoking. In February 1945, the Big Three, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, met at the Yalta Conference. On the surface, they were allies united against Nazi tyranny, but underneath the handshakes, a tectonic shift was occurring. Stalin wanted a buffer zone of friendly states to protect the Soviet Union from future invasions. The West wanted democratic self-determination for liberated Europe. The gap between these 2 visions was an abyss that no amount of diplomacy could bridge. By the time the Potsdam Conference rolled around in July, the atmosphere had curdled. Roosevelt was dead, replaced by Harry Truman, a man who possessed a much shorter fuse for Soviet expansionism. It was at Potsdam that Truman received a coded message about the successful Trinity test in New Mexico. The United States now possessed the atomic bomb, and the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. As the Iron Curtain, a term famously coined by Churchill in Missouri, descended across the continent from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, the world began to harden into 2 armed camps. The United States transitioned from its traditional isolationism to a policy of containment. This wasn't just a military strategy, it was an existential commitment. George Kennan's long telegram articulated the American view that the Soviet system was inherently expansionist and must be stopped at every turn. This led directly to the Truman Doctrine in 1947, pledging American support to any nation resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This was followed by the Marshall Plan, a massive injection of billions of dollars into the shattered economies of Western Europe. It was the ultimate soft power play, proving that prosperity was the best defense against the siren song of communism. The first major flashpoint ignited in 1948 over the fate of Berlin. Deep inside the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany, the city was a beacon of Western influence that Stalin could no longer tolerate. He cut off all land and water routes to West Berlin, intending to starve the city into submission. The world held its breath. Would the U.S. force a convoy through and risk World War III? Instead, they took to the skies. For nearly a year, the Berlin airlift saw American and British planes landing every few minutes, delivering food, coal, and even candy for the children. It was a logistical miracle and a humiliating defeat for Stalin. By 1949, the lines were officially drawn with the creation of NATO, a collective defense treaty that signaled the U.S. would never again leave Europe to fend for itself. But as Europe stabilized, Asia exploded. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists won the Chinese Civil War, sending a shockwave through Washington. The loss of China fueled a Red Scare at home and led to the NSC 60 document, which called for a massive increase in military spending. The tension boiled over in June 1950 when North Korean tanks rolled across the 38th parallel. The Korean War was the first time the Cold War turned hot, a brutal 3-year conflict that pitted American-led UN forces against Soviet-backed North Korean and Chinese troops. It ended in a stalemate that remains to this day, a frozen conflict that served as a grim preview of the proxy wars to come. By the mid-1950s, the nature of the struggle changed.
Stalin was dead, replaced eventually by Nikita Khrushchev, who spoke of peaceful coexistence while simultaneously crushing the 1956 Hungarian uprising with Soviet tanks. The battlefield expanded into the final frontier. When Sputnik beeped its way across the night sky in 1957, it wasn't just a scientific achievement, it was a terrifying demonstration that the Soviets could hit any American city with an intercontinental ballistic missile. The space race was born, a multi-billion-dollar competition for technological supremacy that would eventually lead to the moon, but its origins were rooted in the fear of nuclear annihilation. The early 1960s brought the world closer to the edge than ever before. The Berlin Wall rose overnight in 1961, a concrete scar through the heart of a city that became the ultimate symbol of communist failure, a government forced to imprison its own citizens to keep them from fleeing. Then came October 1962. For 13 days during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world stood still as John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a nuclear standoff over Soviet missiles stationed just 90 miles from Florida. It was the closest humanity ever came to self-extinction, and the sobering realization of that fact led to the first tentative steps toward arms control and a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin. However, the 1960s also saw the United States descend into the quagmire of Vietnam. What began as an effort to contain communism in Southeast Asia turned into a traumatic struggle that tore American society apart. While the U.S. fought in the jungles, the Soviets faced their own challenges, including a bitter split with China that shattered the idea of a monolithic communist bloc. This led to the era of détente in the 1970s, a period of cooling tensions led by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, characterized by the SALT treaties and a pragmatic realization that both sides needed to manage their rivalry to avoid mutual destruction. The calm did not last. The 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan ended détente and ushered in the Second Cold War. This final act saw the rise of Ronald Reagan, who abandoned the language of accommodation for the rhetoric of the evil empire. Through massive military buildups and the Strategic Defense Initiative, the U.S. pushed the Soviet economy to its breaking point. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, he inherited a system that was rotting from within. His attempts for reform, glasnost and perestroika, were intended to save the Soviet Union, but instead opened the floodgates of dissent. In 1989, the world watched in disbelief as the Berlin Wall fell, not to tanks or bombs, but to the hands of ordinary people demanding freedom. By December 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. The long winter was over, leaving behind a world forever changed by the 45-year struggle between two incompatible dreams of the future.
While the lowering of the Soviet flag marked the end of an empire, the transition did not happen in a vacuum. To understand why the world looks the way it does today, we have to go back and examine the microscopic details of the struggle that almost ended everything. The conflict was never just about maps or borders. It was a war of numbers, a relentless race to see who could build the bigger stick. By the early 1960s, both nations had moved beyond simply bombers and into the terrifying realm of the ICBM. The American Minuteman and the Soviet R-7 Semyorka changed the fundamental nature of time. Suddenly, the distance between Moscow and Washington, D.C. was only 30 minutes away. This gave birth to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, a paradox where the only way to stay safe was to ensure that if you died, your enemy died too. It was a suicide pact on a planetary scale. But the Cold War wasn't only fought with missiles, it was fought with shadows. Behind the public speeches and the parade of tanks in Red Square, a secret war was being waged by the CIA and the KGB. In the alleyways of Vienna, the cafes of Istanbul, and the docks of Havana, thousands of men and women lived double lives. This was the era of the sleeper agent and the high-level defector.
Men like Oleg Penkovsky provided the West with the technical manuals for Soviet missiles during the Cuban crisis, potentially saving millions of lives at the cost of his own. Meanwhile, the Aldrich Amoses and Robert Hansons of the world were selling American secrets for suitcases of cash, proving that even in a war of grand ideologies, human greed remained a constant variable. This subterranean conflict created a culture of paranoia that seeped into every corner of American life, from the Hollywood blacklist to the frantic drills in elementary schools where children were taught to duck and cover under their wooden desks as if they could provide a shield against the sun. As the 1960s progressed, the theater of operations shifted heavily toward the Third World. The superpowers viewed the decolonization of Africa and Asia not as a victory for self-determination, but as a series of empty squares on a chessboard. In the Congo, in Angola, and in Nicaragua, local civil wars were fueled by foreign money and foreign weapons. If one side shouted for democracy, the Americans sent crates of rifles. If the other side chanted for the proletariat, the Soviets sent advisors and tanks. These proxy wars meant that while the citizens of the superpowers lived in a state of nervous peace, millions of people in the developing world lived in a state of perpetual violence. The tragedy of the Cold War was that the long peace enjoyed by the North was paid for in the blood of the South. In the mid-1970s, the tension seemed to ease during the era of détente, but this was a fragile illusion. While leaders signed pieces of paper in Helsinki, the underlying machinery of war never stopped grinding. The Soviet Union began deploying the SS-20, a mobile intermediate-range missile that could strike any European capital with almost no warning. The West responded by placing Pershing II and cruise missiles in West Germany and Britain. The anti-nuclear movement exploded in size, with millions of protesters taking to the streets of London, Bonn, and New York. They were the first generation to grow up in the shadow of the mushroom cloud, and they were tired of living on the edge of a knife. The final decade of the conflict began with a sudden freeze. The 1980 Olympic boycott and the rise of the Solidarity movement in Poland signaled that the cracks in the Eastern Bloc were becoming too deep to ignore. In Washington, the Reagan administration shifted gears. They weren't interested in just containing communism anymore. They wanted to win. The introduction of the Strategic Defense Initiative, mocked by critics as Star Wars, proposed a space-based shield that would make nuclear missiles obsolete. It was a bluff the Soviets couldn't afford to call. Their economy, hampered by central planning and the astronomical costs of the war in Afghanistan, was failing to provide even the basic necessities for its people. The bread lines in Moscow were becoming longer than the missile convoys. When the end finally came, it was surprisingly quiet. It wasn't a nuclear exchange that broke the Soviet Union. It was the realization that the system could no longer sustain itself. When the gates of the Berlin Wall opened on that chilly November night, the world didn't see an invading army. They saw people hugging, dancing on top of the concrete, and chipping away at the symbol of their oppression with hammers and chisels. The Cold War ended not with a victory march through a conquered capital, but with the quiet dissolution of a state that had simply run out of momentum. Yet, as the archives opened and the secrets came out, the world realized just how many times we had come within seconds of the end. We didn't just survive the Cold War. We escaped it.
The aftermath of the Soviet collapse left a vacuum that the world is still struggling to fill. But to truly understand the weight of that moment, we must look closer at the sheer scale of the military-industrial complexes that sustained the tension for so long. At its peak, the United States was maintaining thousands of nuclear warheads on permanent hair-trigger alert, housed in silos buried deep beneath the wheat fields of North Dakota and the deserts of Arizona. These were not just weapons, they were a massive, silent infrastructure of annihilation that required a literal army of scientists, engineers, and soldiers to maintain. On the other side of the globe, the Soviets had constructed entire closed cities, metropolises that didn't appear on any official map, where the sole purpose of every man, woman, and child was the development of high-tech weaponry and chemical agents. This was a total mobilization of society, where the brightest minds of a generation were diverted away from medicine or art and toward the mathematics of destruction. This relentless focus on military parity drove a technological revolution that fundamentally reshaped human existence. We often forget that the Internet, the very tool that now connects the world, began as ARPANET, a military project designed to ensure that the American command and control structure could survive a nuclear strike. The microchip, the satellite, and the jet engine all saw their development accelerated by the desperate need to stay one step ahead of the adversary. Even the most benign household technologies, like the microwave oven or GPS, have their roots in the radar and navigation systems developed to track enemy bombers and guide missiles across the North Pole. The Cold War was a crucible of innovation, proving that humanity is never more creative than when it is terrified. Yet, as the technology advanced, the human element became more unpredictable. The 1980s were perhaps the most schizophrenic decade of the entire conflict. While pop culture gave us movies like Red Dawn and War Games, reflecting a deep-seated anxiety about a coming apocalypse, the high-level diplomacy was becoming increasingly surreal. In 1983, a Soviet satellite warned of an incoming American nuclear strike. The system showed 5 missiles heading toward Moscow. It was only the calm intuition of a single Soviet officer, Stanislav Petrov, who correctly guessed it was a false alarm caused by sunlight reflecting off clouds, that prevented a retaliatory strike. The fate of billions rested on the shoulders of one man who chose to trust his gut over his computer screen. This was the terrifying reality of the late Cold War. The systems had become so complex and the stakes so high that a single glitch or a moment of hesitation could trigger the end of history. While the nuclear threat loomed over the Northern Hemisphere, the ideological battle took a different form in the streets of Latin America and the Middle East. The 1980s saw the rise of the Contras in Nicaragua and the brutal civil wars in El Salvador, where the line between freedom fighter and terrorist was often blurred by the needs of superpower strategy. In the Middle East, the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the subsequent Soviet-Afghan War created a new kind of volatility. The United States, in its eagerness to bleed the Soviet Union dry in Afghanistan, provided billions in weaponry and training to the Mujahideen. It was a classic enemy of my enemy strategy that achieved its goal of defeating the Red Army, but it also planted the seeds for a new kind of global conflict that would emerge decades later. The Cold War was a masterclass in the law of unintended consequences. As the 1980s drew to a close, the internal pressures within the Soviet Union became unbearable. The disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986 acted as a physical manifestation of the system's decay. It wasn't just a reactor that had melted down, it was the credibility of the entire Soviet state. Gorbachev realized that the only way to save the country was to tell the truth, but the truth was a poison to a system built on secrecy and propaganda. When he refused to use force to stop the peaceful revolutions in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany in 1989, the foundation of the Warsaw Pact, once the most formidable military alliance in history, dissolved almost overnight. The world watched in awe as the people of Eastern Europe reclaimed their destiny, proving that you can build walls and silos, but you cannot indefinitely suppress the human desire for self-determination. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union left the United States as the world's sole superpower, a moment often referred to as the unipolar moment. But the victory felt strange and hollow to many who had spent their entire lives defined by the struggle. For nearly half a century, every aspect of American identity, from our education system to our cinema, had been forged in opposition to the Kremlin. When the enemy vanished, the United States found itself looking into a mirror, forced to confront the internal divisions that had been suppressed by the necessity of national unity. The transition from a bipolar world to one dominated by a single player was not as smooth as the victory parade suggested. Across the former Eastern Bloc, the transition to capitalism was a brutal shock to the system. In Russia, the 1990s were marked by hyperinflation, the rise of powerful oligarchs, and a deep sense of national humiliation that would later fuel a new brand of assertive nationalism. To truly understand why the tension lasted so long, we have to look back at the 1950s, the golden age of the American dream, which was paradoxically built on a foundation of absolute terror. This was the era of the suburbs, the interstate highway system, and the baby boom. But the highways weren't just for family road trips. They were designed as evacuation routes for major cities in the event of a nuclear strike. The suburban home, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, was sold as the ultimate proof of capitalist superiority, yet many of those homes featured lead-lined shelters in the backyard, stocked with canned peaches and Geiger counters. This was a society living a double life. On the surface, it was all jazz, rock and roll, and technicolor consumerism. Beneath the surface, there was the House Un-American Activities Committee and the McCarthy hearings, where the fear of the enemy within led to the destruction of countless careers and lives in the name of security. The cultural impact of the Cold War was nowhere more visible than in the classroom. An entire generation of American children grew up with the knowledge that the world could end during their afternoon math class. The Duck and Cover films, featuring Bert the Turtle, were a psychological band-aid for a wound that couldn't be healed. These drills created a unique psychological profile for the baby boomer generation, a mixture of deep-seated anxiety and a fierce determination to live for the moment. This tension eventually boiled over in the late 1960s. The youth rebellion, the civil rights movement, and the anti-war protests weren't just about Vietnam. They were a rejection of the rigid, paranoid world their parents had built to fight the Cold War. The irony was that the very freedom the United States was defending abroad was being demanded with renewed intensity at home. Meanwhile, the Soviet side of the cultural divide was equally complex. While the West viewed the USSR as a gray, monolithic prison, the Soviet people were experiencing their own internal struggles. The thaw under Khrushchev allowed for a brief flowering of literature and film, but it was always tempered by the watchful eye of the state. The Soviet citizen lived in a world where public life was a performance of loyalty to the party, while private life was a sanctuary of whispered truths and black market Western goods. Blue Jeans and Beatles records became symbols of rebellion more powerful than any political pamphlet. This cultural infiltration, the slow, steady drip of Western lifestyle and music, did more to undermine the Soviet system than 1,000 nuclear missiles ever could. It was a war won in the shopping malls and the radio waves, long before it was won on the battlefield. As we look at the maps of today, the ghosts of the Cold War are everywhere. The borders of the Middle East, the division of the Korean Peninsula, and the ongoing tensions in Eastern Europe are all direct legacies of decisions made by men in smoke-filled rooms in the 1940s and 50s. The military alliances formed during this era still define global security, and the nuclear arsenals created during the arms race still sit in their silos, waiting. The Cold War taught us that the world could be divided into us and them, a lesson that humanity has found very difficult to unlearn. It was a period of history that proved that while ideas are powerful enough to build civilizations, they are also dangerous enough to destroy the planet.
The story of the Cold War is not just a story of the past, it is the blueprint of our present, a reminder of how fragile peace can be when it is built on a foundation of mutual fear. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire 45-year standoff was not the intentional launch of missiles, but the high probability of an accidental one. As the command and control systems became more automated, the window for human intervention shrank to a matter of minutes. In 1979, a technician at the North American Aerospace Defense Command accidentally loaded a training tape into the live computer system. The monitors suddenly showed a massive, all-out Soviet nuclear attack involving thousands of warheads. For 6 agonizing minutes, American retaliatory forces were scrambled, and the president's doomsday plane took off. It was only after satellite data confirmed no launches had actually occurred that the stand-down order was given. This wasn't a one-off event. Throughout the Cold War, there were dozens of documented broken arrow incidents involving lost nuclear bombs, submarine collisions, and sensor malfunctions that brought humanity to the brink of the abyss simply because of a technical glitch. While the hardware of war was being refined, the software of control was also evolving into what we now recognize as the modern surveillance state. The Cold War turned the act of gathering information into a global industry. The National Security Agency in the United States and the KGB's 8th Directorate in the Soviet Union pioneered the mass interception of communications. Every cable, every radio signal, and eventually every satellite transmission became fair game. This was the era of the number stations, shortwave radio broadcasts of mysterious voices reading lists of digits, believed to be coded instructions for spies deep undercover. The paranoia of the era meant that privacy was a luxury neither side felt they could afford. This culture of secrecy gave birth to a shadow government of intelligence agencies that operated with little oversight, often making decisions that fundamentally altered the course of history without the public ever knowing. The 1970s, often dismissed as a decade of stagnation, was actually a pivotal turning point in the psychological war. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 were intended to stabilize borders, but they included a small, seemingly insignificant clause about human rights. The Soviets signed it, thinking it was mere window dressing. They were wrong. Those words became a weapon for dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and Václav Havel, who used the Soviet Union's own signature against it. They proved that moral authority could be just as potent as an armored division. At the same time, the global economy was shifting. The oil shocks of the 70s hit the West hard, but they masked a much deeper problem for the Soviet Union, its total dependence on oil exports to prop up a failing industrial base. While the United States was beginning to transition into the computer age, the Soviet Union was still trying to master the assembly line. The digital divide was becoming a death sentence for the communist dream. By the time the 1980s arrived, the contrast between the two systems was undeniable. The Space Shuttle program, despite the tragedy of the Challenger, represented a vision of the future that the Soviets simply couldn't match. Their own version, the Buran, flew only once before being mothballed due to a lack of funds. The Cold War was increasingly being won in the laboratory and the boardroom. American pop culture, from Star Wars to MTV, was projecting an image of vitality and choice that reached through the Iron Curtain. Even in the most remote corners of the Eastern Bloc, people were risking imprisonment to listen to the Voice of America or Radio Free Europe. They weren't just looking for news, they were looking for a connection to a world that didn't feel like a prison. This cultural magnetism was the ultimate Star Wars defense, a shield of soft power that the Soviet propaganda machine had no answer for. As we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the Cold War feels like a strange fever dream era of human history. It was a time of incredible cruelty and incredible heroism, of absolute certainty and paralyzing fear. It forced humanity to look at itself and ask if our biological drive for tribalism would ultimately lead to our extinction. We came out of it with a world that was technically unified but deeply scarred. The infrastructure of the Cold War, the bases, the treaties, the weapons, and the mindsets didn't just disappear in 1991. They were repurposed, renamed, or simply left to rust, waiting for the next great shift in the global balance of power. The timeline of the Cold War isn't just a list of dates, it's a map of the modern soul, a reminder of what happens when the two most powerful nations on Earth decide that their neighbor is an existential threat.
While the nuclear and digital races occupied the headlines, a much darker and more secretive competition was being waged in the sterile environment of the laboratory. In the depths of the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union pushed the boundaries of science into the realm of nightmares, developing biological and chemical weapons of terrifying lethality. The Soviet program, known as biopreparation, was a massive, illegal network of facilities that employed tens of thousands of people to turn anthrax, smallpox, and the plague into aerosolized killers. This was the ultimate insurance policy, a way to ensure that even if every Soviet city was vaporized, the victors would inherit a planet of dust and disease. The realization that such programs existed, often continuing long after treaties were signed, serves as a chilling reminder that the Cold War was a struggle where the rules of war were frequently rewritten in the dark. This disregard for traditional limits was equally evident in the proxy wars that defined the latter half of the century. From the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan, the superpowers treated the sovereign nations of the global South as testing grounds for their newest hardware and their most radical theories of counterinsurgency. In Latin America, the United States supported brutal military dictatorships in the name of stopping the red tide, while the Soviets and Cubans funded guerrilla movements that promised liberation but often delivered only more blood and chaos. These regions became the permanent scars of the Cold War, places where the long peace was a cruel joke and where the echoes of Cold War weaponry still ring out in modern conflicts. The geopolitical landscape of the modern world is essentially a graveyard of these ideological experiments. As the final years of the 1980s played out, the collapse of the Soviet system felt both inevitable and impossible. When Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan met at Reykjavik in 1986, they came tantalizingly close to agreeing to the total abolition of nuclear weapons. It was a moment of profound clarity, where two leaders looked into the abyss and realized they were staring at their own reflection. Although the deal fell through over the issue of missile defense, the spirit of that meeting signaled that the fever had finally broken. The wall didn't just fall because of economic pressure or military buildup. It fell because the people living behind it no longer believed in the lie that their neighbors were monsters. The Cold War ended when the fear that sustained it was replaced by a simple human exhaustion. Looking back across the decades, the Cold War stands as the most dangerous period in human history. It was an era where the fate of every living thing on Earth was decided by a handful of men in two cities, guided by ideologies that demanded total victory or total destruction. We survived it not because we were wiser or better than previous generations, but often because we were lucky. We survived the B-52s that were kept in the air 24 hours a day, the submarines that hunted each other in the silent depths of the Atlantic, and the computers that almost mistook the rising moon for a nuclear launch. We survived the era of the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, and the mushroom cloud. Today, the world has moved on to new rivalries and different threats, yet the architecture of the Cold War remains the foundation of our global order. The United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the very concept of international diplomacy were all forged in that furnace of mutual distrust. The lesson of the Cold War is not that one side was perfect and the other was evil, but that humanity is capable of terrifying extremes when it allows fear to become its primary compass.
It is a story of how close we can come to the edge and still find the strength to step back. As we look at the silent silos and the rusting fences that once divided a world, we are reminded that peace is never a permanent state, but a constant, deliberate choice. The Cold War is over, but its history remains a haunting map for the future, a warning that while we may have survived the long winter, the responsibility to prevent another one remains entirely in our hands.